I still remember the sound of that knock. It wasn't the friendly tap of a neighbor dropping by for a chat. It was sharp, deliberate, and full of intent. The kind of knock that makes your stomach twist before you even open the door. I had no idea then that behind it stood the beginning of the worst months of my life. The moment I turned that handle, my peaceful home, the one I'd poured my heart and savings into, would become the center of a war I never wanted to fight. You see, every neighborhood has that one person. The one who believes the rules don't just exist, they own them. In my community, that person was our HOA president, a woman who carried a clipboard like a weapon and a smile sharp enough to cut glass. She told everyone she was protecting property values, but what she really protected was her ego, and she'd destroy anyone who dared to stand in her way. At first, it seemed harmless. A note about my lawn being half an inch too tall, a warning about my trash bins being visible from the street. Little things that seemed almost comical until they weren't, because every notice came with a fee. Every fine came with a threat, and every visit from the HOA felt less like a routine check and more like an interrogation. Then came the day they crossed the line, when they tried to control what I did inside my own property. When that same HOA president barged into my yard, shouting accusations that would make anyone's blood run cold. I can still hear her voice echoing across the street, every word dripping with power and pettiness, while my neighbors watched from behind their curtains, pretending not to. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't the type to back down. Not this time. Because this wasn't just about grass or fences anymore. This was about control, about principle, about the one thing they never expected anyone to fight for, freedom inside your own home. And when the truth finally came out, when the HOA's dirty secrets spilled into the open, the neighborhood would never be the same again. So tell me, what would you do if the people meant to protect your home became the ones destroying it? When I first moved into Willow Creek Estates, it felt like the American dream carved into reality. White picket fences, freshly cut lawns, kids biking home before sunset, and neighbors who waved like they'd known you for years. The kind of place where the air always smelled faintly of barbecue smoke and freshly watered grass. You could almost believe it was perfect, a little slice of peace tucked away from the noise of the outside world. My home sat near the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, a warm brick-sided two-story that caught the golden light of the morning sun. I'd saved for years to afford it. Every overtime shift, every skipped vacation, every careful dollar was poured into that down payment. I wanted a place to start over, somewhere calm after a few chaotic years. The first few weeks felt like I'd finally found it. I planted flowers under the windows, painted the shutters deep forest green, and set up a wooden bench on the front porch, where I'd drink my morning coffee while watching the neighborhood wake up. Across the street, there was Mr. Garrison, a retired veteran who spent most of his days tinkering with old motorcycles in his garage. He was gruff but kind, the type who'd give you advice whether you asked for it or not. Next door lived the Parkers, a young couple who seemed to argue as often as they laughed, but they always invited me to the annual block party. The rest of the residents all fit a similar mold. Middle class, orderly, a little competitive about their lawns, but outwardly polite. And then there was the HOA, the Homeowners Association, a name that sounded harmless, even helpful. In the beginning, I didn't pay much attention to them. I'd seen the pamphlet in the welcome packet, maintaining community harmony and protecting property values. It all seemed reasonable. They managed the landscaping, hosted holiday events, and handled minor maintenance issues. The kind of background organization you don't think twice about. The first board meeting I attended was on a Thursday evening at the clubhouse, a small, neatly kept building near the entrance of the community. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and coffee, and folding chairs were arranged in neat rows. About 20 residents sat chatting quietly while 3 people sat at a long table in front, each with a nameplate and a stack of papers. At the center sat Margaret Hollins, the HOA president. If you've ever met someone who radiates control, you'd recognize her instantly. Her posture was impeccable, shoulders back, chin up, and a voice that carried like she'd spent a lifetime telling people what to do. Margaret was in her late 50s, with a tight blonde bob that didn't move no matter how she turned her head. She wore pastel blazers that made her look like she'd stepped straight out of a real estate brochure. On her right was Neil Baxter, the treasurer, a soft-spoken man with wire-rimmed glasses and an ever-present nervous smile. He looked like the type who'd rather be anywhere else but there. Yet he never disagreed with Margaret. On her left sat Lydia Crane, the secretary, whose lips were always pursed like she was perpetually tasting something sour. She took minutes obsessively, tapping her pen against the clipboard in a rhythm that could drive anyone mad. That first meeting was mostly uneventful. They discussed repainting the community sign, replacing a broken streetlight, and approving a new set of HOA fees. Nothing I found alarming. Margaret even approached me afterward, welcoming me personally. Her smile was all teeth and politeness. "You'll love it here," she told me. "We run a tight ship, but that's why everything stays beautiful." At the time, I took her at her word. For the first few months, everything went smoothly. I kept to myself mostly, worked long hours, came home to tend the garden, waved to neighbors. On weekends, I'd mow the lawn and chat with Mr. Garrison, who always had a beer in hand and a story to tell. It was calm, predictable, safe, but then little things started happening. One morning, I found a note taped to my mailbox, a courtesy reminder from the HOA. It said my trash cans had been left out past the designated pickup time and warned me of a possible fine if it happened again. I remember frowning. It was true I'd forgotten that one time, but it was hardly an offense worth formal notice. I laughed it off, assuming it was just their way of keeping order. A week later, another note appeared, this time about my lawn. Apparently, it was slightly overgrown and detracting from neighborhood uniformity. That made less sense. I'd just mowed it 3 days prior. Still, I complied. I trimmed it again, this time measuring the grass with a ruler to be sure. That's when I started noticing Margaret's car, a silver Lexus, slowly driving past my house more often. Once in the morning, once in the evening. Sometimes she'd stop for a few seconds, pretending to check her phone. Other times she'd talk into her walkie-talkie, glancing at my property before driving off. At the next meeting, I brought it up, jokingly. "Margaret, you sure keep a close eye on things," I said with a smile. She returned it with one of her own, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's part of my duty," she said softly. "We just like to make sure everyone follows the same rules." Fairness is what keeps communities like ours peaceful. Something in the way she said peaceful didn't feel right. The weeks rolled by, and the courtesy notices became more frequent. A decorative flag in my yard was not HOA approved. My mailbox was faded and needed to be repainted to match the regulation color scheme. Even the small solar lights I'd installed along the walkway, which every other house had, were suddenly a safety concern. When I asked the Parkers about it, they shrugged. "Oh, Margaret's just like that," said Jenna Parker. "She's been president for nearly a decade. People have tried to vote her out before, but she always finds a way to stay." Her husband, Rick, chuckled dryly. "Yeah, last guy who pushed back too hard suddenly got fined for a dozen violations in 1 week. Ended up selling his house." That was the first time I realized this wasn't just pettiness. It was control. The tension wasn't loud or obvious at first. It came in whispers, in glances exchanged at community gatherings, in the way conversations died when Margaret walked by. Everyone smiled for her, but no one truly liked her. Still, no one dared to cross her either. Then, one afternoon, something strange happened. I came home from work to find a small orange notice stuck to my door. Violation, unapproved modification. It said I had installed unauthorized external equipment and needed to remove it immediately or face fines. Confused, I walked around my property. The only recent addition was the new rain gutter I'd paid a contractor to fix. A simple replacement, same color, same model. But apparently it hadn't been approved. I tried to reason with them, sending photos and paperwork to the HOA email. No reply. A week later, I got a $150 fine in the mail. When I finally called Margaret, her tone was curt but calm. "It's nothing personal," she said. Rules are rules. We can't make exceptions, or everyone will think they're above the community standards. Her voice was smooth, almost pleasant, but underneath it, I could hear something smug. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing just how much of the neighborhood's harmony depended on fear. Margaret's closest allies, the ones who never seemed to get fined, were the ones who attended every meeting, clapped the loudest, and reported every minor infraction they saw. They called themselves concerned residents. Everyone else called them the watchdogs. There was Brenda Morris, who lived 2 houses down and made it her mission to monitor everyone's trash bins. Tom and Carol Reeves, who took photos of suspicious activity and emailed them to the board. And Dennis Harper, who volunteered for the compliance committee but used it mostly as an excuse to gossip and intimidate. Together, they acted like Margaret's personal police force, whispering, photographing, reporting. Sometimes I'd catch them standing near my fence, pretending to chat while clearly taking notes. The atmosphere changed. What had once felt like a friendly, close-knit neighborhood began to feel like a small, watchful regime. The block parties were still there, the decorations still immaculate, but beneath the smiles was a collective tension, a quiet understanding that everyone was being monitored. Then, one night, as I sat on my porch sipping coffee, Mr. Garrison walked over, limping slightly from his old injury. He lowered his voice and said, "Word of advice. Keep everything by the book. Margaret's looking for a reason to make an example out of someone. You don't want to be next." I asked him why. He sighed, staring out toward the darkened street. Last year she went after the Thompsons for putting up a bird feeder, said it attracted pests. They tried to fight it, but the board drained them in legal fees. Sold their place within 6 months. That was when the chill set in. I began keeping records of everything, every notice, every call, every conversation. I thought maybe, just maybe, it would blow over. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Margaret wasn't just enforcing rules. She was testing boundaries, and I'd already become her favorite test subject. The first time she stepped onto my property without permission, it was over a flower bed. She claimed my tulips were too close to the sidewalk. When I asked how close was too close, she smiled and said, "Whatever the board decides." That smile? That's when I knew this wasn't about flowers or trash bins or gutter colors. It was about power. The quiet kind that creeps up rule by rule until you realize you've lost something bigger than a home. You've lost peace. But the thing about people like Margaret? They always push too far. They mistake silence for weakness. And when they finally cross the wrong person, the one who won't be bullied anymore, that's when the real storm begins. And for Willow Creek Estates, that storm was coming fast. It started small, like all neighborhood wars do. A fine here, a notice there. A whisper at the mailbox, a suspicious glance from a neighbor who used to wave. But soon, it wasn't just small anymore. It was systematic, ruthless. The morning after the flowerbed incident, I found another envelope taped to my door. Notice of non-compliance. Yard maintenance. It accused me of failing to maintain visual consistency with the community landscape plan. I stood in my yard staring at my perfectly trimmed lawn, dumbfounded. Across the street, Mr. Garrison's grass was half a shade browner than mine, but no paper flapped from his door. I knew what this was. Margaret had marked me. At first, I tried reasoning, emailing the HOA, asking for clarification, even attending meetings to appeal. But every time I spoke, Margaret's lips would curl into that same polite smile, the kind that hides a knife behind it. "We'll review your case," she'd say, her tone syrupy sweet. "Please be patient while the board discusses the matter." They never did. Instead, the fines doubled, then tripled. A $50 penalty for excessive mailbox. Where? $75 for unapproved. Lighting. $100 for failure to comply with prior notices. It became endless, a relentless stream of bureaucratic harassment. Dressed up as neighborhood maintenance. By week 6, I had accumulated nearly $700 in fines. I kept every single letter, stacking them neatly in a binder, hoping logic would win out eventually. But logic doesn't work in a place where power is personal. One night, I caught Brenda Morris standing at the edge of my driveway, her phone angled toward my house. The flash went off once, twice. I walked outside, demanding to know what she was doing. "Oh, just documenting," she said, clutching her phone close. "Margaret asked us to keep an eye out for unapproved decor." "Unapproved decor?" I repeated, incredulous. She gestured toward the string of small lanterns on my porch, something I'd hung for summer evenings. "Those, not in the guidelines," I laughed bitterly. "You've got to be kidding me." Her smile didn't falter. Rules are rules. By that point, the watchdogs, Margaret's little alliance, had turned surveillance into a hobby. Every time I left for work, someone would be walking their dog nearby. Every time I came home, I'd find footprints in the dew near my garden bed. It wasn't paranoia. I'd caught them on my security camera more than once. Always the same faces pretending not to look, but recording every move. Then came the inspection notices. These were different. Formal letters announcing mandatory property evaluations. They cited obscure clauses in the HOA bylaws I'd never seen before. I read through the handbook front to back, but the sections they referenced didn't exist. When I confronted Lydia, the HOA secretary, she blinked at me innocently. "Oh, those must be from the updated version," she said. "What updated version?" I asked. She hesitated, glancing toward Margaret, before saying, "The one distributed at the last annual meeting." "I was at that meeting," I said. Nothing like that was mentioned. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then maybe you weren't paying close enough attention." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my living room, binder of notices open in front of me, each letter a reminder of how absurd this had become. I started noticing patterns. The dates of the notices often coincided with the days after I'd questioned Margaret at meetings. Every fine seemed like a retaliation. It wasn't about compliance anymore. It was about control, but things escalated faster than I expected. The next morning, I found a bright orange final warning stuck to my door. "Failure to remedy violations may result in legal action or property liens." That was the line that made my stomach drop. Property lines. They were threatening my home. I called an attorney that afternoon. His name was Daniel Harper, no relation to Dennis, the HOA enforcer, and he'd handled HOA disputes before. After reviewing the letters, he looked up at me and said, "These fines are excessive. Some of these so-called rules don't even align with state HOA law. You're not the first person from that neighborhood to come to me." "What do you mean?" I asked. He leaned back. "You ever hear of the Thompsons?" "Vaguely. They lost their case. Couldn't keep up with the legal fees. But the HOA used the lien process to force a sale. Bought their property through a shell company. Guess who sits on the board of that company?" I didn't have to ask. From that point on, I realized this wasn't just harassment. It was exploitation. Margaret and her board were running the neighborhood like a private fiefdom, punishing dissenters, forcing them out, then buying their homes cheap through backdoor deals. I wanted to fight back. But first, I needed evidence, proof of what they were doing, so I started documenting everything. Every encounter, every meeting, every suspicious car that slowed by my house. I even installed a better security system, multiple cameras discreetly placed. Within a week, they captured something shocking, footage of Margaret herself, stepping onto my porch at midnight, clipboard in hand, taking photos of my property. The next morning, another notice arrived. Violation, unapproved camera installation. The irony almost made me laugh. Almost. By now, I wasn't the only one feeling the squeeze. The Parkers had received a $500 fine for hosting excessive guests. Mr. Garrison was cited for having unsightly garage clutter. One by one, the residents were being picked apart, reminded who held the power. Some tried to resist. Most just gave in. At the next HOA meeting, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Margaret stood at the front like a general surveying her troops, while Lydia took notes and Neil shuffled papers nervously. When I raised my hand to speak, her smile froze. "Mr. Langley," she said, "you've had plenty of opportunities to discuss your non-compliance issues privately. This meeting is for community business." "This is community business," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "You're abusing authority, using fines to intimidate residents. You're not enforcing rules. You're extorting people." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, the only crack in her calm veneer. "Those are serious accusations," she said. "Then prove me wrong," I shot back. "Show the updated bylaws. Show the financial records. Show where all those fines are going." Her jaw tightened. "That information is confidential." That word, confidential, silenced the room. I could see fear in people's eyes, the kind that comes from knowing the truth but being too scared to say it. The meeting ended abruptly, Margaret banging her gavel with more force than necessary. "This discussion is over," she said. "If you continue to disrupt the peace, further action will be taken." The next day, I woke up to find a tow truck in front of my house. My car had parked neatly in my own driveway while I was being hooked up. I ran outside yelling, demanding an explanation. The driver pointed to an order signed by the HOA, claiming my vehicle violated parking regulations. That was the breaking point. I filed a formal complaint with the County Housing Authority, attaching copies of every letter, fine, and video I had. But bureaucratic wheels turned slowly. In the meantime, the HOA turned up the pressure. Brenda began following me around the neighborhood, pretending to walk her dog. Dennis started standing across the street in the evenings, staring without speaking. Once I came home to find paint splattered across my fence. A childish act, but one that sent a clear message. "We can reach you." Then, one night, something happened that changed everything. It was close to midnight when I heard a sound, faint at first, then sharper. A scraping near the side of the house. I peeked through the blinds and froze. There was someone in my yard, a man crouched near the side gate, flashlight in hand. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and zoomed in on the security feed. The figure was Dennis. He was taking photos of my shed. I stepped outside and shouted, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" He jerked upright, startled. "Just verifying a complaint," he barked. "At midnight?" Margaret authorized it. He snapped before storming off. The next morning, a new letter awaited me. Violation, unauthorized structure, shed. Fine? $250. That was the moment something in me hardened. Fear gave way to fury. I started digging. With the help of Daniel, my attorney, we filed a records request with the county, looking for the HOA's registered business documents. What we found made my blood run cold. Margaret's name appeared repeatedly, not just as president of the HOA, but as a managing member of multiple LLCs tied to community improvement initiatives. Several of those companies had purchased homes in Willow Creek Estates over the years, all foreclosed after HOA. Disputes. The pattern was undeniable. When I confronted Margaret with this information at the next meeting, her mask finally cracked. "I know what you're doing," I said quietly as the room fell silent. "You fine people until they break. Then you buy their homes through your shell companies." Her smile vanished. "You're treading on dangerous ground," she hissed. "I'm done treading," I replied. That night, I posted everything I'd found on a private neighborhood forum. Every document, every photo, every piece of proof. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had been silent for years began sharing their own stories, fines that didn't make sense, missing financial statements, strange, anonymous complaints that always targeted the same people. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. For the first time, Margaret wasn't in control, but she didn't go quietly. She sent cease and desist letters to several residents, threatening defamation suits. Neil, the treasurer, resigned abruptly, citing stress. Lydia stopped showing up at meetings altogether. The watchdogs grew quiet, though their glares still followed me everywhere. One afternoon I came home to find a notice unlike any other. Immediate hearing notice. Property in violation of multiple HOA statutes. Failure to comply may result in foreclosure proceedings. It was signed not just by Margaret, but by an attorney representing the HOA. They were really doing it. They were trying to take my house. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, hands trembling as I stared at that letter. Everything I'd worked for, every sacrifice, every dream, was suddenly hanging by a thread. But I wasn't backing down. Not anymore. That night Daniel called with a plan. "We can file for an injunction," he said, "but you'll need to be ready for a fight. They're going to dig deep into your records, your past, everything." "Let them," I said. "I've got nothing left to lose." The following week felt like a fever dream. The HOA scheduled a special meeting to vote on pursuing foreclosure. I showed up early, binder in hand, every document ready. The room was packed. Nearly the entire neighborhood had come. Margaret opened the meeting with her usual poise, but there was tension in her voice. Tonight we are addressing repeated violations by one homeowner whose actions have disrupted community order. She gestured toward me. Mr. Langley, I stood. Before you proceed, I said, I have something the entire neighborhood needs to see. I projected my security footage onto the screen, Margaret sneaking onto my property. Gasps filled the room. Then I displayed the LLC documents tying her to the foreclosed homes. Murmurs turned to outrage. Margaret's face went pale. She tried to speak, but her voice trembled. These are misinterpretations. No, I interrupted. These are facts. You've used this HOA to bully, to intimidate, and to steal, the crowd erupted. People shouted, demanding answers. Margaret slammed her gavel repeatedly, but the noise drowned her out. For the first time, the Queen of Willow Creek Estates was losing her throne. But even then, as chaos filled the room, I couldn't shake one thought. People like her don't go down easily. There's always another move, another threat, and I was right. The next day, I woke to find a subpoena on my doorstep. The HOA was suing me for defamation, harassment, and damage to community reputation. The war wasn't over. It had just reached its boiling point. It all came to a head on a morning that began far too quietly for comfort. The air in the cul-de-sac felt charged, almost electric, as though the very street itself knew that something was about to break. For weeks, the tension had been climbing. Letters slid under doors, whispered gossip at the mailbox, even subtle threats masked as friendly reminders. But today was different. Evelyn woke up before dawn, unable to sleep, pacing her kitchen while the coffee pot hissed behind her. Every shadow outside the window felt like it was watching her. She knew the HOA board had planned something. The last meeting had ended in shouts, with Gary, the HOA president, slamming his gavel and promising that the rules will be enforced one way or another. Evelyn had seen that look before, the smug smile of a man who believed power was his birthright. By 8 o'clock, the street was crawling with activity. HOA volunteers, mostly retirees with too much time and too little empathy, gathered at the curb, clipboards in hand. They weren't there to talk. They were there to make a point. Evelyn stepped onto her porch, clutching the folder that contained every violation notice, every photo, every receipt proving she had done nothing wrong. Gary strutted up the driveway like a sheriff in an old western. Mrs. Dale, he said, his voice laced with mock civility, we've given you every chance to comply. This is your final warning. Evelyn's stomach twisted. Comply with what, Gary? I've followed every ridiculous rule you've thrown at me. My grass is exactly 3 inches. My shutters are regulation beige. What more do you want? He leaned closer. Respect. Behind him the other board members nodded, the mob murmuring in agreement. Then came the sound, a truck engine rumbling to life down the street. Evelyn turned to see a tow truck reversing toward her driveway. Her heart dropped. They were taking her car. That's private property, she shouted, rushing forward. You can't, Gary raised a hand. According to Section 12, Article 5, vehicles with non-HOA decals parked on HOA property are subject to removal. It was absurd. It was madness. And yet the driver, expressionless, began hooking her car. The neighborhood gathered, drawn by the commotion, cameras out, recording. Evelyn felt heat rising in her chest, not just anger, but humiliation. This was what they wanted, to make an example of her, but they underestimated one thing. She was done being quiet. Stop! She yelled, her voice slicing through the chatter. She held up her phone, camera rolling. Every second of this is being recorded. And I hope your lawyer is ready, because this isn't just harassment anymore, it's illegal seizure. The driver hesitated, glancing at Gary. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the president's face. Evelyn took a step forward. You think I don't know my rights? I filed a complaint with the county last week. You served me notices that violate state property law. I've spoken to an attorney. And by the way, your so-called fines? They're under investigation for misappropriation of funds. A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. One of the board members, Mrs. Keener, shifted nervously. What is she talking about? Evelyn didn't stop. "I know about the double billing, the fake maintenance fees, the landscaping contracts you awarded to Gary's brother-in-law's company." Gary's face turned crimson. "You're bluffing," Evelyn smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that felt like power returning to her bones. "Am I?" She pulled out her phone again and hit play. The audio recording crackled to life. Gary's own voice, caught in a conversation about padding expenses to keep the board funded. The crowd gasped. Some neighbors started whispering. Others started filming more intensely. The tow truck driver unhooked her car and quietly backed away. Gary lunged forward, shouting, "Turn that off!" But it was too late. The story was already spreading through every phone, every whisper, every outraged murmur on that street. Evelyn's voice cut through the chaos again, steady now, confident. "You spent months trying to ruin me. But you forgot. People like you always hang yourselves with your own rules." He tried to speak, but his words were drowned out by the rising noise, the clamor of neighbors realizing they'd been manipulated. Later that day, Evelyn sat in her living room as the news broke. County investigators were at the HOA office. 2 board members had resigned within hours. Gary had been escorted out for questioning. The entire neighborhood group chat was a storm of apologies, gossip, and disbelief. Evelyn exhaled, finally allowing the tension to slip away. For months she had lived under the constant threat of fines, humiliation, and fear. But now justice was no longer a fantasy. It was unfolding in real time. The next HOA meeting was packed. For the first time, Evelyn didn't sit in the back. She stood at the front, facing what was left of the board. The new acting president, a soft-spoken woman named Nora, apologized publicly for the mismanagement and overreach. Evelyn listened quietly, arms crossed, eyes steady. When they offered to erase her fines and restore goodwill, she didn't smile. She simply said, "Goodwill doesn't erase what you did. Accountability does." The meeting ended with applause, not for the board, but for her. Neighbors who once avoided her now stopped by to say thank you. The same people who once whispered now spoke openly about change. As she walked home under the amber glow of the streetlights, Evelyn finally felt something she hadn't in months: peace. But she also knew something else. This wasn't just her victory. It was a warning, because in neighborhoods ruled by fear and petty power, all it takes is one person brave enough to push back for the entire system to crumble. So if you ever find yourself staring down an HOA that thinks they own you, remember this: they only have as much power as you're willing to give, and sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or angry. It's quiet, legal, and absolutely devastating. The question now is, if you were in Evelyn's place, how far would you go to fight back? The aftermath wasn't quiet, far from it. The days following Gary's downfall rippled through Oakwood Estates like a storm that refused to die. What had once been a picture-perfect neighborhood, a place that prided itself on community excellence, was now a battlefield of truth, exposure, and long-overdue accountability. And at the center of it all was Evelyn Dale, the woman they'd tried to break, now standing taller than ever. The first signs of change came fast. Within 48 hours, county investigators had frozen the HOA's accounts pending review. The same funds Gary and his cronies had used to fine residents into submission were now evidence in a growing list of charges: fraud, misuse of community funds, coercion, and in Gary's case, falsifying HOA documents. The man who once strutted through the neighborhood like a self-appointed king now sat in a courthouse wearing a wrinkled suit and a look of disbelief. The residents, too, began to wake up. For years, they'd followed the rules out of fear, paying fees without question, repainting their homes, trimming their trees exactly as instructed. But now, those same people who once crossed the street to avoid Evelyn were showing up on her porch with casseroles, apologies, and stories of their own. "They fined me for having the wrong color mulch," one neighbor said, shaking her head. "I thought I was the only one." Another admitted that Gary had threatened to report him for having a basketball hoop in his driveway. Evelyn listened to them all. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The truth was loud enough. The HOA office, once a place of smug smiles and bureaucratic bullying, now sat half empty. The bulletin board outside, where violations were once proudly posted, was stripped bare. For the first time, the words "for community improvement" didn't sound like a threat. They sounded like a promise. But the legal process was slow, and for a while Evelyn wondered if real justice would come. Gary's lawyer tried to spin the story, claiming Evelyn had doctored recordings and manipulated neighbors into rebellion. But the county's audit told a different tale. Tens of thousands of dollars missing, contracts funneled through shell companies, and a pattern of targeted harassment toward specific residents, including Evelyn. When the verdict came, it wasn't just a win, it was vindication. Gary was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and barred from holding any position in a homeowners association again. 2 other board members were fined and placed on probation for their involvement. The HOA itself was dissolved pending reformation under state oversight. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Community leadership is not a license for control. It's a responsibility, and one this board abused. Evelyn sat quietly as the gavel struck. She didn't cry. She didn't cheer. She just breathed a long, deep exhale that carried months of fear, anger, and sleepless nights out of her body. Afterward, something remarkable began to happen. Without the oppressive HOA, Oakwood Estates started to look human again. Lawns grew a little wilder. Kids rode their bikes without being told to stay off the curb. Porch lights stayed on longer, laughter returning to the evening air. It wasn't perfect, but it was free. And for the first time, people weren't afraid of their own neighbors. Evelyn's property, once targeted as the problem house, became a symbol of resilience. Her little blue shutters, which Gary once mocked for being non-compliant, became almost legendary. A neighbor painted theirs to match, then another and another. Soon, a quiet act of defiance had turned into a statement. Oakwood belonged to its residents again. Months passed, and the dust finally settled. Evelyn found herself standing at her garden fence one morning, watching the sun rise over the street that had once felt like a prison. The flowers she planted, wild irises, her late husband's favorite, had finally bloomed. Their color flooded the yard, vibrant and untamed. It wasn't just her yard that had healed, it was her spirit. The anxiety that once clenched her chest every time she saw an envelope in the mailbox was gone. The silence in her house, which once felt like loneliness, now felt like peace. She started a small online group, HOA Survivors, she jokingly called it, where homeowners from all over the country shared their experiences, advice, and sometimes their victories. Within weeks, it grew into thousands of members. Reporters reached out. Legal advocates began using her case as a precedent for reform. What started as one woman fighting her neighborhood board had become a national conversation about power, property, and the right to live without fear in your own home. Evelyn didn't set out to be a hero. She just wanted to keep her garden, her dignity, her peace. But heroes are rarely born from grand ambition. They're made from the quiet refusal to bow down when everyone tells you to. Still, even with justice served, some scars lingered. There were moments when Evelyn caught herself looking over her shoulder, expecting another notice, another confrontation. But it never came. The old HOA building was torn down, replaced with a small community park, the very kind of project Gary used to block, claiming it was too unkempt. Children played there now, their laughter echoing down the same street that once held whispered threats. Evelyn often walked by in the evenings, nodding at the new neighbors who smiled genuinely, not fearfully. Some recognized her immediately. "You're the woman from the news," one teenager said once, awe in his voice. Evelyn laughed softly. "I'm just the woman who said enough." But the story didn't end there. Because the change she sparked didn't just stay in Oakwood. Nearby communities began re-examining their own HOAs. State legislators proposed new laws limiting their power. Homeowners, once too scared to speak, started showing up to meetings armed with questions and courage. Evelyn's victory became more than local justice. It became a ripple. On the one-year anniversary of Gary's arrest, the town paper ran a headline that made Evelyn pause. "From Fear to Freedom: How One Woman Exposed the HOA Machine." She didn't think of herself as the face of anything. She was just tired of being pushed around. But maybe that was the point. Real change doesn't start with leaders. It starts with the people who've had enough. One afternoon, as she sat on her porch sipping tea, Nora, the new reform-minded HOA president, stopped by. "We're holding a community vote next week," she said, smiling, "to officially dissolve the HOA and replace it with a voluntary neighborhood council. No fines, no threats. Just people helping people." Evelyn nodded slowly. "That's how it should have always been." Nora hesitated before adding, "We were hoping you'd chair the first meeting." "You've earned that much." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I think I've fought enough battles." "But I'll bake the cookies," they both laughed. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't bitter laughter. It was real, light, and full of life. When the meeting took place, it wasn't in a sterile HOA hall with a gavel and intimidation. It was in the park under the warm glow of string lights. Families brought chairs, kids played tag in the grass, and people actually talked like neighbors again. No titles, no power plays, just a community rediscovering itself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn sat quietly on a bench, watching the faces around her, the same people who once feared speaking up now laughing, connecting, building something new. She realized that this was the real victory, not the legal battles or the headlines, but the restoration of something far more fragile: trust. She thought of her late husband, who'd built their house with his own hands. "It's not just wood and nails," he used to say. "It's the life you live inside it." For the first time since his passing, Evelyn felt like she truly understood what he meant. Her home wasn't a target anymore. It was hers again. As the night settled in, a cool breeze swept across the park, rustling the leaves and carrying the faint scent of jasmine. Evelyn closed her eyes, listening to the hum of contentment that replaced months of tension. It felt right. It felt earned. Before she left, she glanced back at the community gathered there, her community, and felt a small, satisfied smile tug at her lips. Because this wasn't just a resolution. It was a rebirth, a story that began with fear and fines had ended with freedom and forgiveness. And maybe that's the lesson buried deep in all of it. Power built on control will always crumble, but power shared through courage, compassion, and truth builds something unbreakable.